Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. Today's episode is our first Q&A segment, where Incubate will answer questions we've received from our listeners. We'll cover everything from recent headlines to the process of policy and more. With that, let's get into this week's episode. Before our first question, we do have some breaking news. As many of you might have already heard, SBER Director Dr. Vinay Prasad will be leaving the FDA. We'll have more in a future episode about the people of the FDA and how personnel really can be policy. We don't know too much to make of this announcement, but at the least, we can take away that it's a major shakeup amid an already turbulent moment for the organization. More to come. And with that, let's jump into our first question. Are we moving toward more price controls on drugs? Great question. And a little terminology at the top, because one man's price control is another man's price negotiation. Our thought is that when it comes to the IRA price negotiations, they just simply aren't negotiations. The companies don't have the ability to walk away from the table. So the LinkedIn haters can complain, but these really are price controls, and we should talk about them as such. So are we moving towards more of them? There's two different ways of looking at that question. They're the IRA price controls, which was a new mechanism to bring down drug prices through quote-unquote negotiations. But really, at the end of the day, we'll set the prices. So we'll talk about that because, yes, more of those are coming. Then we can also think about this in the context of the Trump administration and some actions they're taking. So on the IRA drug price program, we are a few months away from the first price controls for year 2026 going into place. That'll cover 10 drugs, and there were some pretty big ones in that. Think Eliquis, Jardiance, and a few others. So beginning in January, we'll be seeing that first set of 10 price controls. In 2027, that list will grow to 15. And in 2028, we'll have another 15, which will be for the first time including Part B drugs. And then in 2029, we'll move to 20 drugs per year having price controls set. By 2031, 100 of the largest drugs could have price controls in place. So the IRA is continuing exactly how its authors intended it to, a growing list of drugs that will have price controls set on them. Another way to think of the price controls is, what is the Trump administration doing outside of the IRA? And this is where President Trump's executive order doesn't necessarily say price controls, but some of those same mechanisms, the government intervening to set what they consider the value of the drug, is on the table. And we don't know what we're going to see, but we do know that this idea of most favored nations that you can hear about in an earlier episode still remains on the table. And the Trump administration seems actively exploring whether or not they could see how to put that in place in our country, which would effectively import the price controls of another country. So do we have more price controls coming our way? Absolutely. There'll be the growing list of IRA price controls, and then we will see what the Trump administration does as it relates to importing price controls from other countries. Let's move to our second and very timely question. They ask, I saw the EU trade deal has tariffs on medicines. Is that true? If so, what will the impacts be? Well, it's a little early to tell, but our listener is right. Earlier this week, a trade deal was announced with the European Union that does include a flat 15% tariff on a host of items, including pharmaceuticals. Check out our tariff episode for a deeper dive on how tariffs might shake up the pharmaceutical value chain. Initial analysts and news headlines suggested that the inclusion of pharmaceuticals could translate to a $13 to $19 billion impact on the industry. But that's about where what we know ends. How will it impact individual companies, and how can we quantify that? We just don't know. Companies are already stockpiling or already trying to move manufacturing domestically. So things that are already in the US before this goes into place won't have tariffs applied. And if they start manufacturing here, tariffs, of course, wouldn't be applied either. We also know that some generics, but not all, will be excluded from this deal. In the complex value chain and the very globalized value chain of developing new medicines, assessing who pays and whether this got passed on to the consumer might be almost impossible. It's also important to note this is separate from the ongoing Section 232 investigation that we talked about in our tariffs episode, that is looking whether or not foreign countries manufacturing our drugs is a national security issue. And if it is, will there be tariffs or other trade measures put in place? We don't know what the outcome of that is, but we do know that they are hurrying up to get that done. So this certainly isn't going to be the last time we've talked about tariffs. It's worth adding that historically, countries don't put tariffs on medicines because they almost inevitably limit access to patients who need them. So we'll be watching to see how companies and countries navigate this, hopefully with patients in mind. Our next question asks, how is the Inflation Reduction Act continuing to impact the investment environment? That's a great question, and per usual, it's a complex answer. As many of you heard and Incubate celebrated, the inclusion of orphan cures in the Congressional Reconciliation Bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill, check out that episode if you want to dig deeper, will undo some of the damage, and we may see secondary indication trials resume. So let's rewind. The IRA made it disincentivized to explore whether or not a drug worked in a secondary indication under an orphan designation. Congress fortunately saw the flaw in that and fixed it in a recent bill. But it's not flipping a light switch. Investors, companies, others changed strategies, moved money. These things aren't easy to spin up. And so it'll take some time to see some of that damage be mitigated. But the pill penalty, one of Incubate's top priorities, remains in place. So small molecule companies remain at a disadvantage in their ability to garner investment and develop new medicines. But the IRA continues to impact investors and small companies in the fact that the pill penalty very much remains in place. So small molecule companies and entrepreneurs remain at a disadvantage, both in developing their medicine and attracting investors. So until the pill penalty is removed, one of the largest impacts of the IRA, disincentivizing scientists from chasing what is right there in front of them, remains in place. Another listener asked, did the White House really freeze NIH funding, and for how long? That's a great question. Just yesterday, the news was out and about, thanks to a Wall Street Journal article, that the White House had told NIH to freeze all funding for research. That is true. It was included in a footnote of a memo that the agency interpreted as saying they no longer had the authority to spend that money. But only a few hours later, they reversed course, and the funds are flowing as they were expected to. We'll also add that congressional support for the NIH and what it means for patients and science remains strong on both sides of the aisle. And even HHS officials have acknowledged publicly that their proposed cuts, which some viewed as pretty draconian, are unlikely to be reflected in the final funding levels for this year. So yes, our listener is right. NIH funding was frozen, albeit only for a few hours, and it seems back on track to get the dollars out the door to where it needs to go. The fight for the future of the NIH remains very much alive. Our last question asks, what is August recess? You mentioned it on a previous episode. That's a little DC speak, some inside the Beltway talk that we'll try to do a better job of explaining on every episode. August recess is a hallowed tradition where members of Congress recess back to their districts and states to check in with their constituents. It's also a big break for staff and others in Washington where things cool down on the work front right as DC is at its swampiest. And so it's during this time that members of Congress can be very much approached by people back home, and they get to hear what's on their mind. For Republican members, it's going to be a particularly interesting recess because they're going home with the hopes of selling the One Big Beautiful Bill and why they voted for it, while also responding to a lot of the activities of the very active Trump administration over the last several months. There's been a lot of concern in these districts about cuts to Medicaid, cuts to other government programs, which have had Republicans somewhat reluctant to do town halls and engage with their members. But there'll be no dodging it during August. So we can certainly expect members to be headed back home, talking about the work they've done, and also hearing about how it is on the ground. August recess is a time where Incubate will be working with our network of investors and early stage biotechs to make sure they get in front of their members of Congress and share our views on policies that need to be addressed this fall. That's all for this episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Have another question you'd like us to answer? Drop it in the comments on our LinkedIn or YouTube, and we'll include it in our next Q&A segment. A reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on the world of policy and innovation. Follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description of this video. And as always, keep innovating.